Hello everyone, welcome to THT, and today I have another great deck tech video for you. This is Boba Cunning. It is probably the strongest deck that I haven't yet covered on this channel, so I felt like it was important for me to talk about it, whether you want to play with it and try it for yourself, or you want to understand this deck a little bit more so you can play better against it. So, this deck is interesting, so it is yet another Boba deck. It's the second Boba deck that I'm covering on my channel, and there's going to be more to come. So some people might think, well, it's just a different flavor of another deck, but turns out that playing double yellow instead of playing green really completely changes the dynamic of the deck. So the original, so Boba Green deck that you've seen played a lot is very much a mid-range deck, a deck that can take a tempo aggressive stance or a control stance depending on the situation. It has a couple of very controlly cards like Overwhelming Barrage and Vader that can allow him to take the aggro stance. Even people now starting playing Reinforcement Walker. This deck is much more aggressive. It is what we call a tempo deck, meaning that the entire objective of this deck is to put some early units to use the Boba turn, the Boba ability, in order to put a lot of threats on the battlefield, put a lot of pressure on the opponent, and then it's going to be using a lot of cards to buy time, to basically to gain tempo. So either by bouncing enemy units using Wayway or other bounce effect that this deck has plenty of, or ways to kind of exhaust enemy unit to prevent them from attacking, and this way essentially win the race and gain a huge tempo advantage. And the Boba Green deck can also do that to some extent, but it's only depending on what kind of card you're going to draw that you're going to do this in Boba Green, while in Boba Yellow it is really the primary game plan. Because pretty much every single double yellow card that we're adding to this deck push you into that direction. So we'll be comparing this deck to how it performs compared to the Boba Green and how it works. I'm not going to talk too much about the leader himself because you probably already know what Boba does. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what he does, but keep in mind, of course, that the idea is very much the same as in the Boba Green, is that we're going to get into that turn 4 where Boba can come into play. We're going to be spending 5 resources to defeat a unit or to make that unit leave leave play. So then we can do this with either Syndicate Laes, Cantina Bouncer, or Bosque in this deck, and then we're going to be readying resources using Boba. And then we're going to be summoning Boba, attacking with Boba, readying 2 additional resources, and then we can play a 3-drop that can either be Boba Fett, 7th Speed Defender, or Body Rook. So, as you can see, it can pretty much do the exact same thing as the traditional Boba deck. It just has to do it specifically on turn 4. It cannot do it 1 turn earlier, like the Boba Green can, which is a big difference. It's definitely a big weakness if you compare it to Boba Green. But as we know, the main quality of this deck, so this is the main inconvenience. The main inconvenience of this deck compared to the regular Boba Green is that it doesn't have ramp, which is definitely a big deal, and it doesn't have as much late game power. However, what this deck has that the Boba Green deck doesn't have is those very powerful double aspect cards that are extremely strong, well, that we cover later on in this video, and those cards allow you to go all in on the tempo plan. And something I want to emphasize is that even though your deck might have weaker cards than another deck, if it has a game plan that is more defined, it's actually going to be just as strong. So you can compensate less strong cards by a better game plan. In this case, we are on the tempo game plan. It's a very defined game plan, and you see this, for example, with other decks as well. Is that good stuff decks, so decks that basically try to play all the best cards in the game, like the Boba Green is, they have very powerful cards, but their game plan is usually not as strong as other decks that have a very clear game plan. You see, what is very strong about this Boba Yellow compared to the Boba Green deck is that every single card pushes in the same direction. Every single card is here to basically to go for this tempo plan, for this aggressive tempo plan, and everything push and pulled in the same direction, which makes the deck just as strong as the Boba Green. I mean, it is not exactly as strong, it's different, right? It is going to have better matchups and it's going to have worse matchup, which we'll cover later on in this video. While the Boba Green deck, yes, it has a lot stronger card than this deck if you compare the card individually, but not all the cards pushes in the same direction, and as I said earlier, it's a deck that can really much play control or tempo depending on what kind of card you draw, and depending on what kind of card you draw. So that's the thing I wanted to emphasize. But for sure, not having the ramp does mean that you're gonna need to have some real 4-drops in order to basically a real turn 3 that you're gonna need. You cannot just simply jump from 3 drops to 5 drops in this deck. So without further ado, let's go into a bit more details into the deck. So on top of Boba, we're going to be playing Administrator Tower. We can also play, of course, the Shopper base. So we are playing the 30 HP base. And the reason for this is simply because after much testing, people realized that having 5 extra HP is simply better than the epic ability of Jeddah City. This has been basically Boba Yellow has been played almost exclusively with Jeddah City for a very long time. People were very positive about the fact that Jeddah City was better. And then relatively recently it has been discovered that no, the 30 HP base is just so much better. So, and the reason for it is because, and that's true in every matchup, by the way, is because Boba Fett very much wants to race the opponent. And in this case, like just having 5 extra HP that doesn't require a specific situation, to use an ability that doesn't require an action to be used, is just much better than the ability to just deal -4 to a unit. Even though there might be some cases where this ability is very useful, more often than not, it is not, because it turns out that basically the main job of Jeddah City would be to disable something like a Sentinel unit, and it turns out that this deck has plenty of ways to do that with, for example, Wayway, Counting Advancer, even bouncing something with Cunning. We have just so many ways to deal with Sentinel units that are much better than just reducing their attack. We might as well just use them, and however, getting 5 extra HP, there's nothing in the game that can really give us that. So Administrator Tower is just simply a better base in this deck, at least as it turns out. So without further ado, we go into the different the card by card analysis. So and we're going to start here with Gito. So Gito, of course, is going to be part of our turn 1 play. Is a great card in this deck because if he is very awkward to deal with, when he dies, reveal something to deal 2 damage to anything else, which is very convenient. We do play quite a few events, but it's still going to be relatively unreliable. But honestly, even if this card was a 3-1 for 1, we'll still be playing it, because it can trade with the Battlefield Marine, it can trade with all the powerful 3-drops that are opponents, and if there's nothing to trade with, it just puts a lot of pressure on the opponent. It's very cheap. The fact that it's very cheap is very useful in this deck because often Boba Fett will allow to ready a resource if we manage to kill something. So able to squeeze a Gito here and there, thanks to that thanks to that ready ability from Boba, is just very useful. Also, we do play other 1-drops in this deck, so we can actually go for a double 1-drop opening in this deck if we want. Just an absolute great card. It is arguably better in this deck than it is in the Boba Green. Next, a card that you might not have ever seen. It is Mining Guild TIE Fighter. So this card I really enjoy in this deck for multiple reasons. It's a card, so obviously 1-2 for 1 is pretty terrible. But this is the thing. It's a card that is obviously most of the time too small for the opponent to mine. Like it's a card that is so insignificant in terms of its stats that the opponent is usually not going to dedicate some resources to destroy it because it's not really much of a threat. But here's the thing, in this deck anybody can be a threat because we have a lot of ways to boost our units. We have Surprise Strike, can give +3 attack to our units. We have Cunning that can give +4 attacks to our unit. So we have a lot of ways to make any unit a threat. And Mining Guild TIE Fighter is a great way to put a threat on the board, to put a unit that is very cheap, that's going to be in space, so relatively difficult to interact with, and your opponent usually is not going to care to actually deal with it, but he might actually regret it to not do it. Another great thing about Mining Guild TIE Fighter is that the Cunning in general is an aspect which is very known to provoke card disadvantage, so we do run out of card with this deck, and this card can allow us to basically draw some cards. It's also another way to utilize the Boba untap ready abilities. Very often with Boba you're going to be readying resources, but you're not going to have any resources to spend those ready resources, and Mining Guild TIE Fighter gives you a way to spend those. So the ability is very useful. Just the fact that you're putting a body on the board is very useful because of all the boosts that we have. And finally, this card is also a vehicle, which matters for our Frontier ATRT. So more vehicles in the early stage of the game, more likely our Frontier ATRT will have ambush. And it is also a cheap Cunning unit, which will allow us to play Cardal Spacer. So Cardal Spacer is also going to trigger more often. So in the same slot, you could play something a little bit more aggressive, like just a regular TIE Fighter, which is a bit more aggressive because it has 2 attack, but it doesn't have the draw ability. It doesn't have the ready ability. Sorry, the draw ability. It's not yellow. So there's some pro and cons. The advantage of just playing regular TIE Fighter is that you can play shoot first, which allows you to actually kill an A-wing, an A-wing, or kill like a 2-3 in space, which can be very useful against aggro. So there's some pro and cons. Basically, I would say, in generally speaking, TIE Fighter is better against aggro. Mining Guild TIE Fighter is better against control. And since I feel like the deck is weaker to control than it is to aggro, it makes sense for me to be running the Mining Guild TIE Fighter because I want to compensate my weaknesses. So that's the reason I choose Mining Guild TIE Fighter. Next we got obviously the good old Cardal Spacer, which I think is better in this deck than it is in the traditional Boba Green, simply because we play a lot more yellow units, so it's much more consistent to use the ability to exhaust an enemy unit that costs 4 or less. And it's once again obeys the game plan a bit better. We're putting a threat and we are tempoing out our opponents at the same time, which is exactly what the deck wants to do. Then we got the crafty Smuggler, which is another great card for the deck, relatively hard to get rid of, which is exactly what we want because, as I said, in this deck, it is an aggro deck, but it is an aggro deck that, unlike Sabine, that can deal damage out of hand for a cause I believe in, or and put cards that are ready. Our deck really needs to have board presence to be able to deal damage, and so we need our units to be able to stick on the board, and the Crafty Smuggler is one of the best units for that. Just a 2/2 shielded, relatively difficult to get rid of. Of course, the good old Viper Probe Droid, just good stats to kill enemy units. And look at our opponent hands, which is going to be pretty beneficial for a deck, especially in combination with Boba Rook. So just a solid units that is going to put some pressure on the opponent and can trade with all the most important 2 drops that have 3 health, like Battlefield Marine and Sabine. Of course, now we're jumping into the 3 drops, and of course we're applying 3 copies of Boba Fett. The Disintegrator. This card is the best 3-drop in the game, as you know, and very powerful in this deck. We have a lot of exhaust effect in this deck, more than in the traditional Boba Green. It's going to make it easier to use. We don't have Energy Conversion Lab, which does make Disintegrator a lot better, but it's overall just a very strong unit that is going to be relatively hard to get rid of, so obviously we're playing 3 of them. Next we got 7th Fleet Defender, so as an aggro deck we need to provide threat on the ground but also in space, because we are going to try to arena dodge our opponents, as most aggro deck wants to do. And 7th Fleet Defender is the best 3-drop we can play in space. Once again, just like the Smuggler, difficult to get rid of and put some pressure on the opponent, and gives us additional vehicle in order to turn on our Frontier ATRT. Sorry. Next we got Body Rook. So Body Rook is the first double aspect card we're going to talk about today, and it is incredible. Just the ability to put a 3/3, look at opponent hand, and discard a non-unique card from it is incredibly impactful. Basically, being able to get rid of a ramp or a barrage is extremely powerful. So if you are the first player, you can actually play Body Rook before the opponent gets to play a resupply. Sometimes it just literally time walks you, because what happens is that you get rid of a card, the opponent has nothing else to play, you have to skip his turn. Very, very impactful. And of course you can get rid of Barrage, which is one of the strongest cards the opponent can play against us. You can get rid of anything. Honestly, if this card gets rid of anything, it's already great value. Obviously, the main problem with Body Rook is whenever you play him and you don't find anything to discard. And that's a big problem. That's a big problem, but so be mindful at what timing you're playing. If your opponent has very few cards in hands, think about kind of like put yourself always in a win-win situation. Whenever you play Body Rook, you're like, okay, if my opponent, I'm very afraid of this card right now. I want to play Body Rook. If my opponent has this card, great, I can discard it. If your opponent doesn't have it, at least I know it doesn't have it. And that's kind of what I call putting yourself in a win-win situation. Is like no matter what happens, you feel happy about it. Sometimes, of course, you're going to blame when you have nothing else to play. That's completely fine, and you're going to mess with it, and it's going to feel bad. But I would say this card is more often than not an excellent card, because when it does hit, it can win you the game. Not only that, it's also a card that compensates once again one of a weaker matchup. I think this deck, if Body Rook did not exist, I think this deck would be a lot worse against control. This card really helps out a lot of control against control, but it's also very good against Boba Green. As I said, you remove the barrage, you remove the ramp, super impactful. And it's also really good against aggro, because against aggro, you remove the 4 cards, I believe in. If you're playing against aggro, I advise you to play Body Rook maybe in the later stages of the game, where you think you can remove a 4 cards, I believe in, or that kind of card. Don't play this card early against aggro, because it's likely to miss. But later on in the game, excellent card as well, even against aggro. Okay, now we're going to go into the more controversial cards, and here it is Frontier ATRT. So, why are we playing this card, which, if you look back to my tier list video, I've actually rated D tier, which I regret. If I had to redo this video, I would probably rate this card C tier. So first, before I want to talk about this card, I want to give a shout out to the person who gave me the idea of this card. It is Poem, which is who is the main person who's running the Late Night Gaming YouTube channel, and check it out. It's a great channel, by the way. And Poem is, in my opinion, one of the most out of the box thinker or deck builder in the game right now. He is really good at playing unorthodox card and making them work. And he's been playing Frontier ATRT in his Boba Yellow deck, and as a result, he's actually in the final of the TTS Top Cut tournament with his yellow deck. So his double yellow deck is very anti-aggro, so I don't think it's the optimal build. But there's a few cards that he plays in his deck which I think are great. And it actually convinced me to run Frontier ATRT. So why is this card good? Well, it's not really that this card is good. It's rather than, if you pay attention, you realize that there's absolutely that 4 drops in general in Star Wars Unlimited are terrible. They are the weakest card in the game. Generally speaking, there's a few exceptions like K2SO for example, but overall 4 drops are some of the weakest card in the game. Even more so in yellow. In Cunning, there's simply almost no good 4 drops in this specific slot. And so I used to play Gamer More and Guard in my main deck, But Frontier Artatrt is actually better because it turns out that the Cunning really likes Boba Yellow, Boba Cunning really likes ambush units, and the reason why he likes ambush units because Boba Cunning always want to be attacking face. It's a very controlled deck. They always want to be attacking face with this unit as much as possible. But sometimes there's a few units that you're going to be wanting to get rid of, and being able to get rid of a unit and putting a unit on the battlefield at the same time is just an extremely impactful play. And that's the reason, by the way, why ECL is so good in Sabine Green, is because it allows you to get rid of enemy units, to get rid of enemy blockers, could get rid of enemy sentinels without while still adding pressure to the board, while still adding some unit to the board. And Frontier Artatrt does exactly that. So obviously, it has the weakness of requiring a vehicle, but it turns out we play quite a few vehicles. We'll play 3 copies of Mining Guild TIE Fighter, 3 copies of Cardal Spacer, 3 copies of 7th Fleet Defender, and if we're ever in a situation where we don't have a vehicle, we can always decide to not restore Frontier Artatrt. It's not a terrible card in other matchup because it has 5 health, and having 5 health is very important against Boba, because Boba himself as well as Bosque have 4 attacks, and being able to dodge these 4 attacks is actually a pretty big deal. So Frontier Artatrt is actually relatively difficult to get rid of for those decks. So it's a card that I like to play that is not terrible even in Boba, but obviously it is mostly an anti-aggro card because it's going to be able to kill you small units while adding a unit on the battlefield. So it's not great. I'm not going to pretend it's an amazing card. This is definitely something I would put in C tier if I was going to rate it now. But it is definitely the best thing we can play in 4 drops, which is definitely the weak point of this deck whenever you have 4 resources. The good news is that we have an alternative. We can either, of course, play a 3 drops alongside a 1 drop, which is another thing we can do that can be very powerful, or we can even play Cunning, which we'll talk about later. Now we're talking to the 5 drops. So 5 drops, of course, essential in this deck to go alongside with Boba. The idea is always to play a 5 drop that can kill something, so then we can double ready with Boba, play a 3 drops, play a Boba, and take over the game. And Bosque is obviously one of the best one you can run. Comes to play, kill something, and leave a body on the field that is extremely impactful if we left alive. But you'd be curious to know that we only play 1 copy of Bosque in this deck, because it turns out that in this specific deck, I actually prefer Syndicate Laes most of the time. So I play 2 copies of Syndicate Laes and 1 copy of Bosque. So which brings me to my next point, Syndicate Laes, which is the other ambush 5 drops that I'm running in this deck. And once again, I'm going to give credit to Poem for this because he's the one who really inspired me to play those Laes in the 5 drops slots for this deck, and I think he's right about this. And the reason for this is because even though Bosque is a stronger card than Laes in a vacuum, in the current meta, Laes is actually extremely well positioned. Because there's a lot of things that Laes can kill that Bosque cannot kill. Notably, obviously, Boba Disintegrator. Laes can kill it without dying. Laes can kill Sabine without dying. And those are 2 very important cards that you're going to see a lot. There's very few things that Bosque can kill without dying that Syndicate Laes cannot. I think the only exception I have is notably going to be what's it called? K2SO. K2SO is really the only card where Bosque has the advantage. In any other case, Syndicate Laes has the advantage. He can also kill 5 health unit like Gideon or Steadfast Battalion, which are the cards which see a tremendous amount of play without while Bosque would not be able to kill those units. So there's a lot of situations where Syndicate Laes is better. And not only that, in the context of an aggro deck, if Laes survives, then he can swing for 5 into the base, while Bosque can only swing 4. So I think that in this specific deck, I have a slight preference for Laes, but I like both cards and I think both have their merit. it depends on the situation. So when I'm hesitating between two cards, I usually go for a split. So then if I'm ever in a situation where I manage to draw both cards, at least I have the option to choose which one I want depending on the matchup. While if I was in a situation where I went all in on Lackeys or all in on Bosque, I don't have that choice. I have to commit. I have to go. So here I like when there's two cards that I think are very close to each other in terms of how good they are. I like to go for a split, so then I have the option to choose which one I want depending on the situation. If I manage to draw both. The other 5 drops that I like is Cantina Bouncer. Cantina Bouncer is amazing in this deck because it is far more flexible than Bosque and Lackeys. Because Syndicate Laes and Bosque can only kill units of a certain size and they have to be on the ground. Cantina Bouncer can get rid of a unit of any size and it can happen on either arena. So it allows you to go for the big Boba turn much more reliably. And the ability simply it's just straight up on top of its synergy with the Boba turn is also just a very, very powerful unit in general. A 3/5 unit that has a Wayway attached to it is just incredibly impactful. So it's a very powerful card, and if you're playing double Cunning, you have to play this card as a 3-of in my opinion. It's just an amazing, amazing card. Of course, after a big Boba turn, where we're putting tremendous amount of pressure on the opponent while dealing with the opponent units, what makes this deck so powerful, and this is the same for the Boba Green deck, is the follow-up that happens after, which is the Fire Spray that comes the turn after and puts so much pressure. And obviously, Fire Spray is even better in Boba Yellow than it is in Boba Green, simply because we are much more of an aggressive deck. We are a tempo deck, so we are very much more aggressive than a traditional mid-range deck, which means that Fire Spray is going to be that much more impactful because it's going to be the perfect finisher for us. Not going to go into too much detail on this card. Everybody knows how busted this card is. So we move on now to the more situational cards. So play 2 copies of Shoot first, which is, even though it is situational, it's still a very solid card in this deck. Can allow us to kill enemy units very strong against aggro. You play it, you kill a unit, you ready a resource, so you can you can literally play that card for free in Boba, which is great. You can also use this card to push just 1 more damage, which might be the difference between losing and winning. Just a really good card. We'll play 2 of them in the main deck. We'll play 1 of them in the sideboard that we're usually bringing in aggro deck. Next we got, of course, No Good to Me Dead, which I think once again is better in Boba Yellow than this Boba Green because it is a very, very tempo focused card, and we are much more of a tempo deck than the green version is. So being able to obviously exhaust a unit for 2 entire turns is a huge thing when this deck can kill someone extremely quickly. Okay, next we got Surprise Strike. Surprise Strike is, in my opinion, the best Cunning card in the game. At least the best mono Cunning card in the game, but I would even argue could be the best Cunning card in the game. It is an absolute auto-include in all Cunning decks, but this is probably the best deck for Surprise Strike because once again, we are a tempo deck. We're here to be aggressive, and Surprise Strike is going to give you this last bit of damage that's going to allow you to kill the enemy base. You can also use it to kill the enemy Bobas. Your Boba is a 4/7. With this, it's become a 7/7, can kill the opponent Boba without dying. That's very relevant as well. But yeah, the main purpose of this card is to push the last bit of damage you're going to need to win the game. Once again, this is the kind of card that makes every single of our units, even no matter how small, even the Crafty Smuggler, even the Cardal Spacer, even the Mining Guild TIE Fighter, become a huge threat because you know you're playing 3 examples of this card into your deck. It's not the card that you're going to need all the time, but when you're going to be reaching the late game, you're going to need that card, and that's why we play 3 of. And this is it is, in my opinion, one of the most important cards of the deck. It's incredibly, incredibly powerful. Next, of course, we got Wayway. Wayway is on removal. It's very the typical tempo card. Basically, get rid of a blocker, get rid of a big unit, so we can race and we can win the race. It's a flexible answer. It is cheap. It is everything we ever want. Next, we got the reason why this deck exists. It is obviously Cunning, the double aspect, flexible card, an incredibly powerful card. If you know how to use it well, because I've seen a lot of people using this card wrong. So let's talk about how you're supposed to use that card. So the most important mode on this card is the +4 attack, +0 defense until the end of the phase. That is the most important mode on this card. That's the one you want, because you're playing aggro. You want to give a +4 boost to a unit and then connect with that attack on the next action and deal 1,000,000 damage. This card is the reason why this deck is so aggressive and can kill someone so quickly, because +4 attack is a huge amount of damage. It's a huge amount of damage. But obviously, since you have to apply the buff and then you have to wait until your next action to attack with that unit, your opponent can interact with it. So you have to be very careful in when you're playing the Cunning. Because if your opponent has a removal in response, he can shut down the +4 attack and you've lost everything, which is not great. So the idea is to play Cunning when your opponent is either tap out or use the other mode to get rid of the thing that could potentially prevent you from connecting that +4 effect. So a typical thing that can happen, for example, is you got a unit like a Cardal Spacer, in front of you there's an A-Wing, you give Cunning +4 attack to your Cardal Spacer, your opponent is just going to trade the A-Wing for the Cardal Spacer and you've lost the +4 attack bonus. That's not great. So what you can do is give the +4 attack bonus, and then you can either exhaust or return the unit back in your opponent's hand to protect your unit. Another way you can protect your unit using Cunning is you give +4 attack, your opponent has only one card left in hand, you use +4 attack and you force your opponent to discard the last card he has in hand, so this way, if this card was a removal, you've protected your unit once again. So basically, obviously it's not always going to be the case. There's going to be cases where you're going to go for the exhaust plus bounce or exhaust plus discard, but 99% of the case, you want to go for the +4 attack as often as possible because it's so impactful. And then the second mode really depends on the situation. The mode that I like the most is obviously the bounce, the Wayway effect, so the return non-leader unit that costs 4 less. But obviously sometimes the double exhaust is going to be more powerful. The one that I like the least is the discard at random. I think it's the most situational. But yeah, pretty much in the context of the tempo deck, so it's a card that does card at disadvantage. It's going to do card disadvantage most of the time, but it's okay because it has so many big upside that it is well worth it. So Cunning is incredible, and the fact that it costs 4 resources is very relevant as well, because as you know, our turn 3 play, so our 4 curve is very weak. So having something powerful to play on turn 3, is very important in this deck. So an incredible card, and then the reason why this deck exists, of course, you won't have this as a 3 obviously. So now that we've talked about every single card, let's talk about the different matchups. Starting with the aggro matchup. So basically, Boba Yellow has a better aggro matchup than Boba Green, which is scary because Boba Green has already a very good matchup against aggro, but I think Boba Yellow has an even better matchup. And the reason is because there's tons of very late game control cards that you play in Boba Green, like the Vaders and the Walkers, which are and also that is not very beneficial versus aggro. Also, the ramp is also a little bit risky to play against aggro. Spending an entire turn not doing anything can be very risky against aggro. So obviously Boba Yellow doesn't have that, and instead it has cards that are incredibly good against aggro because it has exhaust effect, it has bounce effect, which will buy you a lot of time. So what's the sideboard plan against aggro? Well, the sideboard plan is very much so is 3 Gamer guards and shoot first. So Gamer guard is going to be our, we have a weak turn 3 play. So Gamer guard is an excellent card to play on turn 3. That's going to block the board, gives us a Sentinel that can really block the board, and it's going to have Sentinel very consistently because aggro deck typically don't play a lot of removal. So we are very likely to have a Cunning unit when Gamer guard comes into play. And another reason to play Mining Guild TIE Fighter, by the way, because it makes it even more consistent. And yeah, it's going to be annoying for the opponent to deal with. The reason why I don't like Gamer Guard in the main deck is because it's very weak against Bosque. So it's very weak against Boba in general. An additional copy of Shoot First, which is an excellent removal, cheap removal you can play against aggro. That is very good. And we take out 3 Waylays, because Waylay is typically not as good against aggro, because it plays a lot of very cheap units. And if we are really in need of a bounce effect, we still have Cantina Bouncer, we still have Cunning, so we don't need that many Waylays. And then Mining Guild TIE Fighter, which is typically not very good against aggro because it doesn't race very fast. The draw is irrelevant against aggro. We're never going to need draw against aggro. And more important, with that being said, we still keep 2, so it will be intuitive for you to think that we should take out all the Mining Guild TIE Fighters, but we still need a certain amount of vehicles for ATRT to function, and ATRT is an excellent card against aggro. So I still keep a certain critical mass of vehicle in my deck to try to make sure that ATRT is consistent enough. The next matchup is Boba Green. So against Boba Green, typically Boba Green is the worst matchup for this deck, and probably one of the reasons why this deck has not been considered to be a tier 1 deck is because it has a relatively bad matchup against Boba Green, and the reason is being when there's 2 decks that are very close to each other, usually the slower deck is going to win, and in this case the slower deck is Boba Green. So mid-range versus tempo, usually mid-range wins. It's just the way it works in terms of the dynamic of the matchup. Also, simply the ability for the Boba Green to get his Boba turn 1 turn earlier over the Boba Yellow is often a very big problem. With that being said, it is not an unwinnable matchup by any means. I actually played Boba Green in the last Top Cut tournament, and Poem, which is currently in the final, he hasn't played his final game yet, but he is in the final. He actually beat me with that Boba Yellow. It actually beat me 2-0. So that means even though this matchup is bad and we can all agree on it, it is still a winnable matchup. By the way, he's going to be playing the final against another Boba Green. So we'll see if he's able to repeat that performance again. And anyway, so what's the plan in this matchup? So the plan, this matchup very often results into a very tight race. So Change of Hearts is very useful in a situation. Taking control of the opponent fire spray is incredibly impactful. So we run those 2 Change of Hearts and additional copy of Shoot First because we play very similar unit. Shoot First allows your Boba Disintegrator to actually kill a Boba leader, which is super useful without even taking any damage. We also play Waylays. So we take out the Waylays to save us because we already have enough bounce effect in our deck, and usually gonna get replaced by Change of Hearts, which perform a similar role. And then once again a Mining Guild TIE Fighter, because this is still a very fast matchup, so usually the TIE Fighter the TIE Fighter draw effect is not super relevant. But once again, we want to keep a certain amount of vehicles for the ATRT, even though ATRT is not nearly as good against Boba that it is against Control. It's still a decent card, and it's the only thing we can play on turn 3, so we have to have something. Here's the Control matchup. So Control is a matchup that I think is relatively bad, but then if you add all those cards in, then it can turn into a pretty good matchup, especially with Body Rook. So basically what we're adding in this matchup is we add 3 Swoop Racer, which might be a very weird card to see in a sideboard, but it's actually pretty good against Control, because turns out there's not that many things in the game that deals 3 damage. There's actually nothing that deals 3 damage in the game. It's either it deals 2 damage, so -2/-2 with the make an opening, or you have to go all the way up to 4 or 5 with the open fire, the takedown, and the so the 3 health is actually pretty optimal, and it has 4 attacks, which is very aggressive. So Swoop Racer is actually, with Body Rook, one of the best 2-drop turn 2 you can have. And actually on turn 2 I would rather have a Swoop Racer than a Boba, because it puts more pressure. It's just as easy to kill, and it puts no pressure. So obviously there's taking into account the opponent might have a unit with 3 attack or something. But usually Control deck rely on their removal to deal with units, not on their units. So yeah, Swoop Racer is just an additional threat that we can play early on in the game to put pressure. One of the things that is very important about the Cunning deck is that it's a deck that relies a lot on its units that rely a lot on buffs. So it relies a lot on Cunning, on Surprise Strike to take the extra damage. And here's the thing: you cannot use Cunning, you cannot use Surprise Strike if your units are dead. If you have no units. So and Control, of course, is known for having a lot of removal. So in the context of a control deck, it's actually when you're playing against Control, it's very beneficial to remove some of the events and add more units, because more units. Because if your opponent can deal with all of your units and all you have left with are buffs, the game is over. So whenever you're playing against Control, you want to have as many units as possible to put as much pressure as possible. And that's why we're playing Swoop Racer. Because it gives us more units to put on the battlefield, so then more stuff that your opponent is going to have to answer. If you can put multiple units at once, even better. Try to swarm the ball with a lot of units. And this way, we're always going to have something to play our buffs on and deal some real damage. Next, we got 3 Change of Hearts, which is also additional units because they're units that we're stealing from the opponent. Control decks often play very large units, so obviously taking control of them is extremely beneficial. It's an excellent finisher against Control that doesn't require us to have a board. Anything that allows us to deal damage without having a board is extremely valuable versus Control, and that's the reason why Fire Spray is probably the best card in our deck against Control. As we're taking out the No Good to Me Dead, which is really not what we want against Control. We're taking out the Shoot First, which once again we do not want to be using our unit to kill enemy units. We want to use our unit to deal damage. So Shoot First is going to go out for that reason. And then Cardal Spacer, which I felt like was the weakest units in this. Once again, exhaust effect are not very strong in this matchup. So it's it's a threat, but among the threat that we can play, it's probably one of the weakest ones. So I feel like comfortable just taking off the Cardal Spacer here. Yeah. So this is it. This is the for the most part, this is the how's it called, the sideboard plan. And now we're going to go into the next part of the video. So we're going to talk about the mulligan. So how do we mulligan? How do we resource? There you go. Let's try a first mulligan here. As you can see, there's no turn 1 play here, so we cannot keep this hand because we are playing an aggro deck. We want to put pressure on the opponent. I'm going to mulligan this one. Okay. So this hand is pretty bad as well, but it does have a turn 1 play, Mining Guild TIE Fighter. So we can play Mining Guild TIE Fighter. Then we can, next turn, we hope that we're going to be playing a 3-drop. This deck plays 9 3-drops, so the likelihood of us finding a 3-drop next turn is very high. And then if we reach the Boba turn, we're going to have some pretty insane stuff. So it's not a great hand, but since we mulligan, we have to keep it. So new hand now. Okay, new hand. Double Mining Guild TIE Fighter. Or but rather I would go Mining Guild TIE Fighter plus Gito turn 1. That is a pretty good opening. I'm gonna restore the Mining Guild TIE Fighter, probably will restore the No Good to Me Dead. I try to never restore Surprise Strike unless I really have to. And then once again we're hoping to draw a 3-drops, which we have plenty of in this deck. Worst case scenario, we can play a Cardal Spacer, exhaust enemy units and add more pressure. Okay, here we got a turn 1 Gito. Turn 1 Gito is, even though it's less resource efficient, it is stronger than a turn 1 Cardal Spacer. Turn 1 Gito, and then once again we're hoping to draw a 3-drop. And then we got for the turn 3 we got the Cunning or Wayway combined with the Shoot First or something like that can be very powerful. Here typically I would resource one of the Cardal Spacer, and I would probably resource the Shoot First, depending on the matchup. Either the Shoot First or the Wayway I would resource. Try to never resource a Cunning, because it's one of the strongest cards in your deck. Jesus Christ, I'm finding some pretty bad hands here. This deck is very flexible, by the way, on turn 1 and turn 2, because turn 1 we're talking about a deck that runs 9 2-drops, 9 2-drops, and 6 1-drops. And Gito, I said, it's a 1-drop technically, but it's almost as good as just a 2-drop. So the deck is extremely consistent. And then on turn 2, we are running 9 3-drops, which is once again way above average. So the deck is very flexible. So I'm just being very unlucky here. Okay, Mulligan. Okay, this is a much better hand. Okay, finally a good hand. So here we can go Gito, Mining Guild, TIE Fighters turn 1, turn 2, 7th Fleet Defender, turn 3, Frontier Artatrt, then Fight Fire Spray, and then we're probably gonna find a 5-drop because we have 3 turns to find a 5-drop, so very easy. We play a lot of 5-drops, so very easy gonna be playing the Fight Fire Spray. We'll resource the Viper Probe Droid here. Maybe we resource. Another play would be to open up with Viper Probe Droid and resource those 2 cards instead, so that you can go Probe, Defender, ATRT. It really depends on the matchup. There's some decks in which playing 2 threats in turn 1 is very good. There's some where it's not so good. It depends on the deck you're playing against. Okay, and this hand is pretty decent. We're doing the Mining Field Gito turn 1 very often here. That's what we're gonna do. Restore the Cardal Spacer, Wayway. I try to always have a 5-drop if I can for the Boba turn, but keep in mind that in the yellow deck, 5-drops are the Boba turns comes 1 turn later compared to a Boba Green deck because of the ramp. So keeping a 5-drop in your opening hand is not as important as it is in a Boba Green, because you're gonna have more time to draw into that 5-drop. And once again, we play quite a few of them. We play the Bosque, we play the Bouncer, and we play the Lackeys. So, and obviously, during the Boba turn, you don't have to have a 5-drops. Obviously, it can just be something else. Like, it could be something else that you can just play a combination of other things, which is completely acceptable. So this brings me to the conclusion of this deck. So basically, what I think about this deck, I think it is, in my opinion, it is in the top 3 best deck in the game, in my opinion. It's a Boba deck at the end of the day. It has better matchup against Aggro than the Boba Yellow, than the Boba Green. Sorry. Against the Boba Green, it's a bit weaker, and it is also quite strong against control. I think it is. It has about the same odds against control. So against control, I would say not having the ramp is a big deal, is a very big weakness. However, having a more focused game plan, having a game plan that is only focused on being tempo, is far stronger than being mid-range. Tempo decks are generally better against control than mid-range. So yes, you're missing out on the ramp, but you're getting a better game plan. So that's usually how I think about the. So all in all, it's still about a good matchup against control, as you can think. So it's a very strong deck. If you happen to have the Boba Fett and you don't have Vaders, for example, I can strongly encourage you to play Boba Cunning. If you want, you can even play a budget version of this deck. Boba Fett Disintegrator is a strong card in this deck, and I obviously would recommend it. But you can totally play this deck without him. If you replace the Boba Fett by some Swoop Racer into the main deck, it's actually not a terrible idea, and it will make your deck tremendously cheaper. So if you want to play a budget version of this deck, simply replace the Boba Fett by the Swoop Racer, and this deck suddenly becomes very, very budget, because then the last legendary is going to be Cunning, and Cunning is not that expensive of a legendary card to acquire. So that's if you want to build a budget version of this deck, because yeah, the deck is, if you want a very strong deck that is relatively budget and you do not want to play aggro, this deck is for you. I mean, this is an aggro deck as well, but it's as I said, it's a bit more tempo. It has some interaction in there. Anyway, I will of course once again would like to thank Poem, which is the person who inspired me for a lot of those choices. I mean, the ATRT, the Syndicate Laes, and the Swoop Racer in the sideboard. Those are like the 3 main things that Poem inspired me about on this deck. So check out his YouTube channel because he's a very good player. It's the Late Night Gaming channel. It's L8NG. And yeah. So this is currently. So thank you very much for following that video, and I'll see you next time.